So the Ankeny Hill Nature Center founding partners, the Salem Audubon Society, the Friends of the Willamette Valley National Wildlife Refuge Complex, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the Willamette Valley refuges, are honored to host and sponsor tonight's talk. The Ankeny Hill Nature Center, for those that don't know, opened on February 5th and is committed to being an accessible and inclusive nearby nature spot for you. It's always free and it's open every day from dawn to dusk. And the Ankeny Hill Nature Center is on Kalapuyan land. The culture, the people, it is not a thing of the past. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. We have been so very much looking forward to this evening. So thank you for being here, staff. You and your work are so inspiring, and we appreciate you sharing with us tonight.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here, and I just want to say I can't see everyone, unfortunately, but I do want to say thank you to everyone who is here this evening. I know you could be, zoning out on the television or something like that, so I appreciate you joining us this evening, and you might eventually zone out on me. So let me just share my screen really quickly, and then I'll introduce myself a bit. One sec here. All right, let's see. Okay, so like was previously mentioned, I'm Steph Littlebird, and I am the curator of This is Kalapuyan Land, which was an exhibition that originally opened at Five Oaks Museum, which was previously called Washington County Museum back in 2019. And now the show has kind of turned into all kinds of things. And so it's really exciting to share the show and some history about Oregon and the Willamette Valley with you this evening. So skip forward here. Before I start in on the history aspect of the presentation, I wanted to just give you a little bit of background on the Five Oaks Museum because they're a really special institution, and they, like I mentioned, were originally the Washington County Museum, and they were sort of started as like a repository for the descendants of people who came over on the Oregon Trail. And so the museum sort of became this place. It's almost like a time capsule there. It's amazing. They literally have a full covered wagon inside the museum in their archives. So they also have lots of like native objects that were collected during that time. And basically the original sort of point of the museum was to sort of honor pioneer history. And over the years, the museum sort of lost relevancy to the community. And in 2019, shortly after our show opened, they decided to rebrand from Washington County Museum to the Five Oaks Museum. And the Five Oaks Museum is a reference to a historical site that's actually located in Hillsborough off of Highway 26. And it's basically a collection of oaks that have been standing for a really long time. And they're a site of both tribal and settler sort of interactions and a place of trade. So the Five Oaks is a special area, and that's what the museum is named after. And so with that rebrand, they decided that it was important for them to tell different stories. So not just stories about pioneer history, but stories about other communities that are in the, Washington County, but also the broader sort of metro area. And so their very first exhibition under this sort of revamping of the museum was This is Kalapuyan Land. So the original exhibition was called This Kalapuyan Land, and it existed for about 15 years prior to me being invited to the museum to be a guest curator. And part of my job, which is a little bit outside of being a regular curator, is that not only would I be bringing in artworks, I would actually be reviewing and correcting a exhibition about my tribe that existed but was not created in collaboration with anybody from my tribe. So it was made about us, and the information within the exhibition was very outdated. It also had a lot of biases in it and really didn't prioritize Native perspective. And so part of my work was actually going through and editing the panels, and I actually used Sharpies and like taped over stuff and wrote over all kinds of stuff. So if you want to see these panels up close after this presentation, go to the Five Oaks Museum website, because they have them all documented in high definition. So you can go in and look at all the corrections that I made if you're interested. But it originally sort of came in what is in the first image here on the slide, which is like very much your sort of standard gallery museum experience. We mixed in that contemporary art because while we are talking about Indigenous history, we also wanted to remind people that Native people are still here, that we're your neighbors, we're your friends, we're artists in the community, and that Oregon's Native people were not extinct or annihilated, which is something that I was taught growing up as an Indigenous person from Oregon in my own Oregon high school history class. So I know that there's a perception that there aren't any natives left in the community, and actually there are. Oregon is home to the 9th largest urban Indian population in the country. Portland metro area is like something like 50,000 Indigenous people, and not just Oregon Indigenous people, people from all over Turtle Island. So it's a very unique place, and it's important to recognize that history. So unfortunately, the exhibition closed early due to the pandemic. So at that point in 2020, when it closed, we decided to document it fully and put it online so that people could continue to access the information. And after that, then the museum said, we want to do like a yard sign exhibition. And so they call it Museum at Our Place. And you can actually get sets of these signs that have the "This is Calipoian Land" on one side, and then on the other side it has contemporary Indigenous artwork or shows some of the panels from the exhibition. And then there's like QR codes so you can learn more. But basically it takes that museum experience out into the community. And we've actually had OSU and U of O, among many others, actually do their own yard sign exhibitions on campus or in the communities. So it's really cool. I never thought that yard signs would have so much power, but they do. And that was really, really cool to see the exhibition sort of take on a whole new life. And from that, which is interesting, is that all of these things have sort of come to what's happening now, which is that This is Calipoian Land is actually going to reopen in February at Pittock Mansion. And so if you've never had a reason to go up there, which many locals to the area have never visited Pittock Mansion, it's actually one of Portland's top 10 destinations for visitors from out of town, but locals never go there. So they're trying to, I think, do something similar to Five Oaks, where thinking about connecting to their community more. And so this is sort of part of that first step into their new identity as Pittock Mansion 2.0, essentially. And they are inviting Indigenous people to take over the museum a bit. So it's very exciting. And Pittock Mansion actually is on Calipoian and Chinook territory, sort of on a boundary line between the two. So it's very important land in terms of the tribal presence in Oregon. So very excited about that. And this is, just so you know, this presentation was created for someone other than me to present it to you. So there's a quote on the screen that I said, and I'm going to read it to you, but I don't want you to think I'm a weirdo. I would not quote myself normally, but in this case, I'll read my words to you just so you can get a better idea of sort of my approach to how I titled the exhibition, and also then like thinking about it from, the edits perspective. So let's see here. When the museum invited me to take a look at the exhibition in its untouched version, the first thing that I noticed was the title. And to me, the language as a writer was really important. The subtlety of words can actually create a mythology in a way. And so when we say "This Calipoian Land," which was the original, there's a sort of disembodiment that happens with that language. Like, what does that mean? Whereas is very much now, and it is currently our land, and it has always been our land. So it's also a land acknowledgement built into the title as well. And then this one's sort of talking about the historical panels, and how, for me, they weren't historical panels, they're like personal history. when you mention the dryness of the historical information, I think that the human experience gets lost when we look at historical information from like a museum context. People are just looking at words or images of people that are from a different time, so it doesn't necessarily have contemporary context. So for me, when I'm looking at these panels, I see my family history, I see the things that have happened not only to my family, but to the people in our community and continue to. And so for me, it was important to emphasize that while these things have happened in the past, they actually continue to influence our daily lives in many ways. And so I'm a writer as well as an artist, and actually, I work as a tech writer, and I also write arts and culture stuff. So for me, I'm very much like into how words can be used to subtly shift people's perspectives. And I think that that this exhibition in its untouched form very much was subtly sort of asserting white supremacy in many ways. And so for me, it was important to like sort of call out the times when that language is being used, or when it was, sort of being used to shape a narrative silently in a way, and it's just like one word can transform something entirely. And so that's very much a present in the title. This is Kalapuyan land, because as I mentioned, some people think that we're not here anymore. So we have to reassert our presence. All right, so this is part of the first set of panels that you would have seen when you walked into the exhibition. And it's basically a map of the region, which includes Oregon, Washington, Idaho. And if you didn't know, this region has a lot of Native people in it, if I hadn't mentioned that before, even prior to contact. And in particular, the Willamette Valley has a very diverse population of Indigenous people, and metropolitan in many ways. And I'll share with you some of the ways in which we really interacted with many people from the region, and even farther away in some cases. So this map is a great way to sort of frame the region that you're in. And then also thinking about language, you can sort of see some of the changes that I made as we zoom in here. But let me just give you a little bit of a closer up on the Willamette Valley. So everything in orange is the Willamette Valley, and you can see, the Clackamas, the Tualatin. Tualatin Kalapuya is also known as the Otfality, and you can remember that by like saying the word Tuality. It's very similar, Otfality, and that's actually where that word is derived from. And so the Otfality is who I descend from, and they're from the Willamette Valley, but more northern. But then as you go south, you have the Santiam Kalapuyan, and then you also have some like the Mary's River Kalapuyan. And so you have sort of these different bands that are offshoots, but the Kalapuyans also spoke a sort of similar root language, but within each band, they had their own version of that language. So technically, we still have Santiam Kalapuyan language, but we don't have Otfality Kalapuyan language, unfortunately. And so that was lost through colonization. We did not get it recorded before the last speakers were passed away, unfortunately. And so we're working to recover some of it, but likely we'll never be able to fully recover that language. And so, anyway, the Willamette Valley and surrounding areas are very diverse and have all different kinds of Indigenous people, not just Kalapuyan people, that are, sort of inhabiting it or bordering it. And here's another zoom in of the sign, and the title of the sign, the Indian Tribes and Languages of the Old Oregon Country. So as you can see, I took out two words in that title, Indian being the first one. The reason why is that as a younger Native person, I am aware that it's a generational preference, but I say older Natives don't mind using the word Indian, but younger Natives do not like that word. They regard it as a slur. And so what I always tell folks is that if you're not sure what the right term is to use, Indigenous is always safe. Native American people and Indigenous people of all backgrounds, Indigenous means place-based identity. It's literally a reference to like where you're from. And so when you say someone is indigenous, you're honoring the place that they come from, and Native people, really, that's a big part of their identity, is where they come from, where their tribe originates from. And so you're always safe with indigenous if you don't know a person's tribal lineage specifically. And the other word that I took out of there was old. Again, Natives are always sort of portrayed in sepia tone. We're never portrayed as being existing in the current, time. And so taking out words that place us in the past is really important, because we are constantly fighting that there is actually a phrase that is used in the community is "we are still here," and it really is something that we have to constantly repeat to people. And so getting rid of language like that, where we are sort of like relegated to the past, was really important in my edits. And then actually, as you zoom in, oh wait, hold on one sec. Yeah, I thought this was going to zoom in farther, but it's not. At the very top of that, if you see the word Willamette, just love to dispel this rumor if I can anytime. Growing up, I was asked many times, does the Willamette Valley, does that mean Valley of Death? And I always like to dispel that, because it's actually, Willamette means something very beautiful. It means water spilling over, or to spill or pour water. And so if you know about Willamette Falls, and it was basically the largest waterfall on the West Coast before they turned it into a paper mill, that's what the name is from those falls. And so when you think of where you're from, I can assure you it is not the Valley of Death. It is you're from the valley where the water pours over. And so that is very beautiful. And if you hear that out in the wild, you can dispel the myth now. All right, so as I mentioned, we incorporated contemporary art into the exhibition so that people could, sort of be reminded that we're still here while we're grappling with all of this history. And I invited not only people from the Kalapuyan tribe to be a part of the exhibition, but also people from all tribes that are from the Pacific Northwest, essentially, people who are living in the Portland metro area. And so one of the people that I invited was Angelica Trimble Yanu, and she is Oglala Lakota. She went to Pacific Northwest College of Arts, PNCA, which is now a part of Willamette University in downtown Portland. And she is just like this amazing printmaker. This is what's called a monotype. And so the traditional sort of purpose of printmaking was so that you could make multiples really easily. And that, sort of born from like bookmaking or newspapers. But actually, Angelica uses the process of printmaking to make one-of-a-kind prints that you can't make again. And so this is called a monotype, and her work is very much talking about her heritage through abstract imagery, and I'll sort of reveal a little bit more of that to you as I move through this. But this piece to me is just like such a beautiful representation of the ways in which Indigenous art can present itself. And so sometimes we think of Indigenous art and we might think of something very specific like feathers or fringe behind me, but then you might see something like this on the wall and you might not necessarily know that that's Native work, right? And so I think that it sort of surprises people a little bit, and that's good, because we want to sort of upend people's expectations of what Native art should look like, because we tend to have to conform to people's like visual expectations in a lot of ways. And so Angelica's work is so beautiful and modern, and that's why I wanted to incorporate it. And she explains what this work is actually about, and it's called a Layeska. And a Layeska is a Lakota word, and this word means an interpreter between two worlds. Sometimes a Layeska translates between the spiritual world and the human world, or a Layeska can communicate between the Lakota world and the settler world. Art can also be a type of Layeska. And so in this quote from Angelica, she's talking about the idea of walking between two worlds. And that's something that I think Native people more broadly experience that feeling. I know that I do as a Native person who also is an illustrator and a writer. I work in an industry that is not, you know, all Native or anything. And so I have to like balance my community values with this other world that very much sort of expects us to have all assimilated essentially. And so Native people are always sort of like, especially artists, I feel we're always trying to honor our history and our culture, but at the same time they're like having to walk in this world that in the art world in particular that does not necessarily recognize Indigenous people as having anything worth of value contributing to that conversation. And so we struggle a lot. We're trying to do best by our communities, but also living in a world that doesn't necessarily even believe that we exist. And so we're fighting against a lot in order to make our work. I wanted to show a picture though of Angelica in her traditional homelands so that you could see where her work is inspired by. So to me, now that I see the landscape, as I was mentioning before, the idea of indigenousness is that we're very much attached to our land, our home. And so Angelica's home landscape is very different than mine. Mine is all trees and beautiful green valleys, but Angelica's is stratified mountains with all kinds of layers of thousands of years, you know, millions and billions of years of sediment. And so her visuality in her work is very much a reference to the land. And so, and then what's neat is that the image that I showed you of the print that she made, that monotype could totally be hung as just like a regular two-dimensional print on the wall. But then she also takes them and she folds them into three-dimensional objects. She photographs them in nature. She'll hang them like mobiles, you know, and so they become sculptural. And so I just love the idea of that Laiesca again, and of the work being transformative and that it can take multiple forms. And so her work very much sort of reaffirms that idea, and actually the other artist that I show you a little bit later does that as well. And so yeah, but now I love seeing that translation in the land. It so connects to that Indigenous identity and that place-based identity. All right, so this is the lifeways section of the presentation, and lifeways is a word that Indigenous people use quite often. Lifeways means like the way in which we live our life and the things that we do each day, you know, that we might refer to as tradition. And so these panels were edited in a different way than say some of the other panels, which are more like contested history. This was really about like emphasizing certain things that are important to us in the landscape, including different plants and resources, and also some of the things that we've done to maintain the landscape, you know, prior to contact. And so let me zoom in here. So this is from that panel and part of the area that I underlined. So under Kalapuyan stewardship, the Willamette Valley was a carefully managed landscape designed and controlled by fire and harvesting. The fields and prairies, so ideal for agriculture encountered by early settlers in Washington County, were systematically stewarded by the Kalapuya since time immemorial. And so this is a part of another myth that we like to dispel, which is that many people refer to us as hunter-gatherers in like in a diminutive way, and that we, because of that, because we did not practice agriculture, that we weren't as evolved as our European colonizers. And we would like to say that we were intentionally engineering the landscape. So while we didn't practice agriculture, we absolutely engineered our landscape. And I actually just learned last week that the Amazon rainforest is an engineered landscape. So that goes to show you that Indigenous people are absolutely interacting intentionally with their lands, but they're doing it in a way that looks different than the way that you know, European folks have done it. And so we are intentionally engineering the landscape, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go into the different resources. The very first intentional engineering is, to me, the most obvious, which is controlled burns. And what's cool is that in the last decade, fire people within that sort of institution of fire management have really started to engage more with tribal communities about our controlled burn practices, because even prior to modern day Oregon, actually the forest density in Oregon was less, and that's because of controlled burns, and also helps minimize wildfires. And so part of the benefits of having a controlled burn in indigenous culture is, one, you get rid of all the bugs, so it controls pests. It also helps you be able to, like, clear paths if you're hunting game. Also, it enriches your soil. So when you burn off all of that, grass and stuff, that charcoal gets incorporated into the soil and it becomes amazing. And also helps to grow some of the resources that I'll talk about later. But another thing that I didn't know until very recently is that firs, and in particular the Doug fir, which is totally like an icon on Oregon landscape to me. Firs are actually, they can be toxic if they get out of control, because if there's too many of them in an area, they basically create what's called a fir desert. And so then nothing else can grow except for the firs, and they sort of stamp out all life. And so part of doing the controlled burns is that you would then also kill the fir saplings. And so you would make it so that those younger ones couldn't grow and then, continue to sort of overtake the environment. And that is a way to sort of manage growth of specific plants so that other plants can flourish, and so that the environment can also remain in balance, essentially. And so, it has so many benefits to it. And unfortunately, when settlers came here, they pretty much put an immediate stop to controlled burns. And so we haven't really been able to do controlled burns since the mid 1800s, essentially, and are just now sort of getting to resume that practice. Another resource that is something that an icon on the Oregon landscape and also Pacific Northwest landscape. It's very important to tribes up and down the coast. It's called the camas, and it's a flower that's actually related to asparagus, which is really weird. But at the bottom of this beautiful purple flower is a bulb that is very similar to garlic. And what we would do is harvest these bulbs each year, and we would roast them over low heat for multiple days. And then within a few days, they basically turn into something that tastes like caramelized onions, and they're delicious. And so they were an abundant resource, especially in the spring, in the spring months when these babies are popping up out of the mud, and they are very much like those locations for camas fields when you can see them in the Tualatin Valley or in the Willamette Valley. They are incredible. It's like electric purple. And so I know that Savi's Island has some patches that they're restoring now, but there have been some efforts in the broader Portland metro area to start restoring some of these camas patches that unfortunately were lost due to industrialization, colonization, and just sort of a suburban sprawl. So it's really cool to see them coming back, and that non-native groups are actually getting involved in that resurgence of this plant. And actually, here is a picture of one of our tribal elders actually digging up a camas plant, and you can see all the purple behind her, but she's using something called a cup and stick. And it basically is just a stick that would have been, everyone would have one, and you would have it cut to your height, essentially. And at the top, you would have like an antler handle, and you would just use your stick to break up the soil so that you could easily remove the bulbs from the soil. And so everyone would have their own cup and stick. It's very important that you have one that's your size so that you can, be the one who digs up the most bulbs, essentially. it's not supposed to be a competition, but it can be. And so for us, this is like really exciting. This is harvesting time, you know, and being with community. And so harvesting of camas is like a really important practice for not only the Calipoian people, but for many tribes in the region. Another resource that we harvested would be the white oak acorns. And so Oregon white oak is, you know, an important resource for the Willamette Valley, specifically the Atfalati Calipoians. And so when we go back to the Five Oaks site that I was mentioning, the historical site, that likely was a what's called a oak savanna. And an oak savanna is another engineered landscape. Oak savannas don't exist naturally in Oregon, and the ones that do exist now are usually in wildlife refuges or in preserves. There's only like 5% of them left. But basically they were these landscapes that were tended to by Indigenous people, and you know, the spaces were cleared so that these oaks could grow and produce tons of acorns for us each year. And what we would do, I love this, which is I always wondered this, because the mortar and pestle, they're really heavy, especially the old ones. They're like boulders. And this is the answer that I have always been searching for, which is that they just buried them at the tree and came back each year. And so you would essentially bury your mortar and pestle each year after you process the acorns, and then you would just come back and it would be there. And so that really also speaks a lot to the cyclical nature of tribal life in the Willamette Valley, and that we could literally bury something under a tree and come back for it the next year and it would be there over and over and over again. And so, you know, it really, again, pointing to that intentionality and that relationship with the land that is very intimate. Absolutely, you know. All right, let's see. Okay, so this is one of my favorite plants of all times. So I will say both ways that it's pronounced. One, it's pronounced Wapato. It's also pronounced Wapatu. And so either one is okay. It depends on which tribal person you're talking to. So my tribal resource manager says it's Wapatu, but somebody I know that's Yakima says it's Wapato. So we will say that either one is fine, but basically Wapato is a beautiful plant that if you start looking now that you know, if you've never heard of it before, you will see it everywhere in terms of like wetland areas or ponds. The Wapato is a beautiful arrowhead shaped leaf with white flowers on it, and typically is going to grow in like shallow waters, wetlands, or it could be sort of like on the entry to a lake in that area. And the Wapato actually, that actually just means water potato. And so at the bottom of this beautiful plant is a bulb that we would harvest, and it is very similar to, it's like a tuber, but we would harvest these and do a similar preparation where we would roast them like the camas. And these have a ton of starch in them, so they're really good in terms of nutrition and like, you know, body brain power. And so we would harvest these each year when they would come into season. And how we would harvest them is that we would wade into the water and use our toes to break up the roots in the bulb from the mud. And then as it broke away, it would actually float up to the top of the water. And so you could just pick it right up off the top of the water. You didn't have to like go digging around in the mud or the water to get them. And so it was like a genius, totally simple process, and you just use your toes, which I love. So you don't even need tools, just your toes. And so the Wapato is a very, very important plant, not only to the you know, folks in the Willamette Valley, but all along the Pacific Northwest coast as well. So it goes by different names, but it remains a sort of central plant that we harvested each year. And one of the places that we harvested was at Wapato Lake. And Wapato Lake is located out in Gaston, Oregon. And this image, as you can see, does not look like a lake. It was originally a lake, but unfortunately when it was determined that Oregon had really great land for agriculture. This lake was filled in and used as, basically, a field for plowing. And I think there was like some, I'm trying to think of the right word, but basically, water for irrigation. So it became like an irrigation ditch, basically. So it used to be our basically our overwinter camp. So this is where we would have built our pole houses or a longhouse. And this is where we would have spent our winters, because a lake would have offered us many things, many resources that would help us sustain through winter months. And so this place is sacred to us. It's an important place. And unfortunately, when we originally negotiated the treaties, we wanted our reservation to be at Wapato Lake, but unfortunately, we did not get what we wanted from that treaty. And so we ended up with a reservation at Grand Ronde. And so this land now, though, just in 2007 was originally put under National Wildlife Refuge. It's a national preserve, it might be. But basically, since 2007 has been under federal government's care, and now they are working with the tribe to restore Wapato Lake. And so it's very exciting, because this place that used to be such a sacred place for us in terms of our yearly journeys and rituals and ceremonies and traditions, that this place will be restored. And that's very exciting, because of what happened to it in just such a short amount of time, and how it sort of can be restored to become a wetlands for birds, and be a place where both native and non-native people can come back together, so it's very exciting. Our tribe is like so excited by the restoration of this lake. All right, another resource might not surprise you is cedar. Red cedar in particular is important to all Pacific Northwest tribes up and down the coast, all the way down to California as well. And we use cedar for all kinds of things, for canoes. We used it for, baskets. I actually have this is a cedar hat of mine. And as you can see, it's just strips of cedar. And what's cool is that what we would do is harvest the interior cedar, and you can harvest the bark without the interior bark, of the cedar without harming the tree. And so what you would do is you would open up the exterior bark, and underneath it is a second bark that's waterproof. And so you can use that bark because it's really straight, and you can weave all kinds of stuff like baskets, rope. Also just using cedar to keep things inside of a cedar box, because it's anti-bugs, so you can protect it from getting eaten by moths and things like that. So cedar was very important for many different reasons, and incorporated into so many different crafts and practices of both my tribe as well as all the tribes up and down the coast. Here's a picture of one of our pole houses, just so you can see. It's like 3 bus lengths long. It's pretty big. And these would have originally been like a multi-family use structure. So in this image, you're seeing it as like a ceremonial place, which is how we would use them now. But back in the day, there would have probably been partitions in here, so that multiple families could sort of have privacy in their spaces. But the one thing that would be the same is the central hearth, where we would have, a fire going. We would be, maybe drying fish. We would be fixing our baskets, and, connecting communally. And so, these spaces are really important to us, and remain important to us. They've just sort of shifted in the way that they're activated now. But this is Kathlopodal. It's actually Chinook pole house up in Washington. Another resource that was very important to us, but it was actually a currency used on the Pacific Northwest coast. It's called dentalium, and it's a shell, but it doesn't come from Oregon. It actually comes all the way up from Vancouver Island in British Columbia. That's the only place that you can find them. And like I said, it was used as currency back in the day. So this picture of this young lady with all this dentalium all over her, that she has a lot of money. She was a rich lady. So nowadays, Dentalium is very hard to find. It's still used in our regalia, but it is very expensive. I have a Dentalium medallion of a hand that I have that is like prized object because getting big shells, like you can still find them, but they're very expensive because unfortunately they have been sort of like over mined by tribes, but also they were used by the fur trade, all the fur trappers that came from Canada down into the Pacific Northwest coast. All right, let's see. Oh, so there was a picture included on that Lifeways panel of a Calipuyan man, and this illustration was actually made prior to European settlement of the, or even you know, like the Oregon Trail. This was drawn before this. And this image for me is really special because if you look at it, you may not realize that it's sort of giving you all of these signals about Calipuyan life. And so the one thing I love about Calipuyan life is that it was very metropolitan, that we were interacting with people of all kinds. And so the first thing that tells you that is his shoes. If you look at his shoes, there is no way those are native shoes. Those very much look like he probably traded a French fur trapper for those shoes. They look very European. And so we know that he's interacting with somebody who's definitely not from that continent. And he's also carrying a seal skin quiver for his bow and arrow. Obviously, seals are not in the Willamette Valley, so he would have likely traded for that seal pelt or that quiver from, you know, tribal people near the coast or upper on the Columbia, somewhere closer to that, you know, coastal inlet, essentially. So that tells you that, and that's like, okay, so that's, you know, north of our territory, but then he's also wearing an elk robe and hat, and elk are not typically found in the Willamette Valley, so likely maybe across the river, you know, closer to the mountain or maybe closer to the coast. So yeah, these things tell us that he definitely wasn't just hanging out in one spot, or that they were an isolated culture, right? So the Calipuyans were interacting with all kinds of people even prior to European contact. This is another piece from the exhibition, and this is by an artist named Derek Lavore, who is Modoc. And this is a cow skull that's painted with the colors of a salmon or a trout. And so again, going back to that idea of the Laiesca, and this idea of walking in two worlds, Derek sort of explains what this piece means. One side of my family relied on work from the farms, and the other side are members of the Klamath tribe. I understand the agony of both sides over dam removal. And so as you may or may not know, the Klamath dams are coming down next year. It's very exciting, but the duality of Indigenous identity is that we are walking in two worlds. And so we can recognize that we had wanted those dams to come down since they were put in 100 years ago. But we also recognize that's going to impact people's livelihoods. And we're, you know, empathetic people, so we can't help but not recognize that while we might be happy for something, that we recognize that there are loss. And so that trouble that we experience comes through in many different ways, and this piece is very much speaking to that experience that contemporary natives experience, I think. So the last set of panels that I did are very much more about the painful history of the Calipuyans with contact, you know, broken treaties. As I mentioned, the Wapato Lake, we wanted that, which is in this old map here on the left-hand side of the screen. There's like a little tiny square, and that's what we wanted. Unfortunately, that's not what we got. And when we say broken treaties, the reason we say that is because originally we were promised something like 60,000 acres, but within less than 100 years, that had actually dwindled to 500, or I'm sorry, 5 acres. And the reason being things like the Land Claim Acts, Dawes Act, things like that, were basically, you know, encouraging people to get their 40 acres and a mule, come get this Indian land. And so our land became less and less as more and more people came to settle. This timeline is a timeline that I actually worked on with my tribal scholar, who is also a Grand Ronde tribal member, David Lewis. He is an amazing human who knows, he's pretty much the world's foremost expert on, Pacific Northwest tribal history. And so we worked on reworking this timeline that was originally created by the museum that basically prioritized, settler history. So, things like first European arrives on the Oregon Trail or something, and we're like that's not really important to us. That's really just like important to settlers. And so we reframe the timeline to have things like when we had our tribal sovereignty restored by the federal government, when we had it taken away, when we created our tribal constitution and things of that nature, so that we could tell more of our story and less of the colonizer's story. And so again, some of this work is really just trying to point at the institution and like not doing a good enough job of representing other people's history. And this happens a lot with Native history, is that we're not seen as the experts on our own stories. And so a lot of the times people tell them for us and they unfortunately get them wrong. And so, a lot of that work is really just trying to update those perspectives and incorporate Native perspectives into the timeline. I definitely suggest, if you want to read some of these updates, go to the museum website, because you can zoom in and actually read them. But a little bit closer in, you can see that, it's like I had to cover up stuff and add stuff and contextualize stuff, things that were barely mentioned, needed more information and things like that. Another set of panels that was really the most painful for me to edit personally was related to the Indian training school. It was the first built in Forest Grove, and it was there for about 4 years, and then it was moved to Salem where it exists now. It's called Chemawa. And it was, one of the first federal, Indian schools, basically, that, assimilated children by force. They were taken from their tribal families to these schools. Unfortunately, many of those children passed away. There's actually been inquiries both in Canada and now in the US to the sites of these schools, because there are hundreds of them spread across the continent, and there are mass graves at many of them. And so many of these children, unfortunately, were sort of sacrificed in the name of assimilation. And so these schools hold a lot of painful history for our community. And unfortunately, the way that these panels presented that information didn't really do it justice. And so there was a lot of work taken to make sure people understood what they were looking at when they were seeing these images of these children. Here is the original image that's sort of featured on that panel of these children when they first were there at the school. It's like a before and after. But if you count in the second image, which was taken 7 months later, one of those children is missing, and it's because they passed away. And so, but these images, if you see, the children are wearing completely different hair, completely different clothes. They likely would have been given Christian names. They're not allowed to speak their traditional language anymore. And this is used to raise money to fund these schools as like, hey, look what we did. And so for us, it's dehumanizing and a history that continues to impact our community today, but not much is really known about this history by non-Native people, and definitely intentionally sort of suppressed. And so this is a painful part of Oregon's history and the Willamette Valley's history. And so with that being said, what's cool about my tribe is that we are resilient, and we have achieved our tribal sovereignty, and we are doing great things with it, taking care of our community, but also taking care of the broader community. And so I am so proud to be from the Grand Ronde Confederation and to represent our, history and be contributing to the community in a positive way now. And so with that, I will stop my lengthy spiel. And if there are any questions that you would like to ask, I would be happy to answer them now.
There are a couple of questions down below.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Let's see here.
And thank you, Steph. That was wonderful. Looks like a shout out to the amazing restoration work on tribal lands that Grand Ronde is doing, and asking if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass.
I was gonna say, I just saw Braiding Sweetgrass. I'm like, it's such a wonderful book, especially if you're like, I'm a science nerd, so I love to learn about stuff anyway. But that book is so amazing because it's an Indigenous woman who is also a scientist, and her experience, the Lyeska experience of walking in two worlds, and also like realizing that how Indigenous knowledge has sort of been suppressed, but actually that it has great value to the community, not just to ours, but everyone's. And so highly recommend Braiding Sweetgrass. And actually they are working on a young adult version of that now. So it'll be available for younger kids to read as well, which I'm very excited about because it's a great book.
Very cool. And if anyone does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A section as well. But just wanted to say too, that was incredible. And your words are shifting perspectives. They're powerful. It is transformative work. So just so appreciative of all that you're doing. And I heard you say too, you read it in the museum. For those that have not checked out the museum exhibition, please go to Five Oaks Museum and check it out, read the panels and check it all out. It's amazing. But addressing errors and erasures, and that has forever stuck with me and always will. And I'm always on the lookout for errors and erasures, thanks to you. And those words, like I said, have stuck with me since I read them.
I'm like, that's so great. And really, that was my biggest thing about, is that we all do it. We all go into these places that we perceive as having authority, like a museum, and we think that the information that they're presenting us must be accurate. And so we sort of like take what they say at face value, but actually those institutions are just as capable of making mistakes as any other human. So
yeah, so that's just such important work. So thank you so much. And let's we do have another question. Sharing that, so appreciate your words. Are there other books you might recommend?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I would say, let me think. My brain, now I just had like 3 and now my brain is going nowhere. Hold on a second. Lies My Teacher Told Me is a great one. Particularly that is addressing the history of Christopher Columbus and how he was a sociopath. So, the celebration of Christopher Columbus is highly problematic, and not just because of what he did to Native American people, which he actually, it's like, read the book, you'll see, but he was a total sociopath and, was like enslaving people everywhere he went, and even shipped an entire tribe to a different continent so that they could be slaves, and those people actually still exist today on the wrong continent. So he's a wild character, but not somebody that we should celebrate. So I definitely recommend that book.
No, thank you.
So I sent out a message allowing people to turn their mic on if you'd like to ask your question in person.
And here's another great one is, which museums and places do you recommend folks go to get more about Oregon's Indigenous lifeways?
Great. Oh yeah, great question. So I recommend my own tribe's museum called Chichalu, and that's actually out on the Grand Run Reservation. It's like pretty close to the Spirit Mountain Casino. And it is a beautiful museum on top of it being a tribal museum that I belong to the tribe, but it's a beautiful museum. And right now there is an exhibition of, he's passed away recently, but he is like a tribal artist who was sort of like undiscovered, and they're doing this retrospective exhibition on his work, and it is incredible. And so they're not just talking about tribal history there, which they do talk about, but they're also talking about contemporary work and having some great critical conversations. Also Warm Springs Museum, they have their museum's great, but also even though it's not a tribal museum, the High Desert Museum out in Bend, they're amazing. They do some really great work in terms of like tribal narratives. So, but yeah, there are museums. It's kind of like Five Oaks. It's like, there are museums out there that are trying to do it. Same thing with Pittock Mansion. It's like inviting in these opportunities for conversations. So more and more happening now, which is good.
Wonderful. I want to just share some kudos and thank you with you. It says, thank you, learned so much. Looking forward to learning more. Congratulations on editing these panels. Can't wait to learn more. And just another sorry.
I have a question. I had 2 questions I put in the chat. Apparently only one of them was put forward, and that was the one about braiding sweetgrass. My second one is, Steph, this is amazing. Thank you so much for doing this. And are you aware of all the work that the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde are doing to replace native habitat? I had the amazing opportunity to go on a field trip with them to their native plant nursery and walk along some of the places, and I was blown away. So I'm just, it's a big shout out. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's really awesome. Honestly, I'm from Grand Ronde, but I'm specifically Calipuin and Chinook, but the Grand Ronde Confederation is like nearly 30 bands and tribes essentially. So what's really cool though is they are starting to sort of build this a native plant nursery and become this place where even people who are into studying plants are coming to study plants. And like it's really exciting to be part of a tribe that is really like contributing to the resurgence of culture. There's a question about the restoration of Willamette Falls from David on here, and that is another thing that's really exciting because the Willamette Falls again was a sacred site for us, and also a place that we would like go to hunt eel and other things of sustenance, right? So the falls are very important to us, or I should say eel, lamprey is the word that we use there, but the site has been destroyed because of industrialization with the paper mill, and so now the tribe is working to restore it, and not just for the tribe but for the broader community to enjoy it. And it is going to be like a diamond in the Pacific Northwest. Like when they finish that place, it's going to be crazy beautiful, and I'm just like so excited to be alive to see that happen. So yeah, I'm very excited about Willamette Falls.
That's awesome. And that's also a part of your museum.
Yeah.
Down at the Chachaloo. Yeah.
Michael, do you have a question?
This is Michael Babbitt. Is that who you're asking from? I tried putting in a question in the Q&A, but I think it maybe didn't get through. I basically just thanking you, Stephanie, for a really great presentation. I really appreciate your perspective there. And one thing I was kind of curious about was, a lot of folks, and many of us here are working in restoration projects, the idea of restoring, habitat. But I'm curious what Indigenous folks might think of that, particularly, of course, I understand that a lot of times, people have the idea of restoring an area to something that really isn't what would happen naturally on its own. So it can be a little bit more complicated than what you might think. So I'm just kind of curious if you had any other comments on that.
Yeah, I think, it's like people can have the best of intentions, but not really know like how something should go in perspective of, say, like historically how something was. And so, I think that if you're looking to restore a habitat, or if you're working on that type of thing, consulting the local tribal people is always a good way to go, because they likely have a deeper knowledge about that specific area and what would have grown there, or what would have traditionally been on that site, right? And so again, that's like the tribe working with people in the Portland metro area to sort of restore these camas patches, right? And so where they would have traditionally grown, but we're not saying like, let's go ahead and take over, all of, I don't know, some random fields somewhere with camas, right? We're trying to restore the places that they would have traditionally known to grow. And so, yeah, I always say, try to consult with local tribal members if you can. Usually tribes have a website, so you can reach out to them directly. Folks are always surprised by that, but any federally recognized tribe will have a website and email that you can access and contact them.
Yeah. And I know, I'm glad, it's one good thing to see is that at least a lot of the folks doing some of this restoration work are adopting some of the old techniques, particularly fire.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and thank you, Steph. I know you need to run to another presentation, but just beaming so much gratitude and appreciation your way on behalf of all of us. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, you guys. I hope you have a wonderful evening.